Welcome to What Matters, Water TV and Podcast, a new forum that looks to address emerging issues and personalities tackling California water challenges. My name is Charlie Wilson, and I'm privileged to serve as the Executive Director or CEO of the Southern California Water Coalition and your host for this series. Today, we have the opportunity to speak with three of the smartest, most sought-after experts in the California water dialogue to discuss a wide variety of topics ranging from water resiliency, California water policy, and how to communicate with diverse interests on what can be a highly technical set of issues. With us today is Ellen Hanak with the Public Policy Institute of California, the foremost authority in California water policy. Also, Newsha Ajami, the Director of Water Policy with Stanford University's Water in the West. And Faith Kearns. Faith is a scientist and author who regularly writes about water, wildfire, and climate change. So let's dive in, shall we? Well, welcome Ellen Hanak. Ellen is the Vice President and Director of the Public Policy Institute of California Water Policy Center and Senior Fellow at PPIC here in the state of California. Under her leadership, the center has become really that critical source of information and guidance for natural resource management in California, including water policy. I mean, it's a long list of publications and things that Ellen's been involved with, but suffice it to say, she's authored dozens of reports, articles, books, water policy, including managing California's water. What a perfect guest, Ellen. Thanks for being with us to be able to talk about what matters and what matters in water policy. How are you?
I'm great, and so delighted to have this moment to chat with you, Charlie.
Well, it's been a while, and I really appreciate you taking time to be with us. And I want to, really kind of start us off right, because I indicated, I mean, you and PPIC really are the focal point for, studying, looking at these really complex issues around California's water and water management, and sort of how it fits into that bigger picture. But you wrote, I'm going to take you back to the, 2011 timeframe, and work that you did where, I mean, you admitted California's water management is this huge, decentralized, hundreds of local and regional agencies responsible for different individualized aspects, whether it's supply, treatment, drainage, management, flood control. I mean, it's all kinds of people. And that decentralization across all of that function of government really becomes difficult to manage, difficult to make sense to the public. But where do you see us today? I mean, you've had 10 years to sort of really kind of, I'll say, boil on that issue for a while. Do you see it any differently? Do you see it any better, worse, based upon sort of the headlines of the day and the continued struggles we have in meeting resiliency and water demands for the state?
Well, thanks for that little trip down memory lane. And so that you're talking about this book that I did with a number of great colleagues, and the title was Managing California's Water. The subtitle was From Conflict to Reconciliation. So we were trying to be hopeful there about ways to get past the chaos and the fighting. And I guess I would say, we're a nation state, right? Practically. I mean, California is a big place, 40 million people. We've got a lot of geographic diversity in our water systems and our water conditions. And so we've got as you say, a pretty decentralized system for managing water. But what I've seen kind of over time, and in the last 10 years, we've seen sort of more of this, is folks really working to kind of scale that up and try to find ways to work together better. And yeah, I think Southern California is a great example of that. There can be the team squabbles, competitions between the local, a little bit of local stuff. But at the same time, in a drought like the extreme drought that we're facing in the state right now with the changing climate, folks are figuring out better and better ways to work together, to pull together.
Well, I think that comment actually is a good one. I mean, we talk to it a lot. California is, advantages, disadvantages. Advantage, California is really big and really diverse and really complex. Bad news? Yeah, California is really big and really diverse. And depending upon where you come from, people come with such a different perspective. we've been struggling with this, I want to say 30, 40, 50 years. Why is it within that diversity, as much as we tout, the diversity as a strength, why is it so hard to try to resolve some of that top line, the efficiency and management issues, so that you can get down into the lower elements, sort of let that local government do what it does best and meeting those local needs. But at a certain point, you got to have that top line dealt with. And that seems to be where we are really stuck.
So, I think, if you think about California water, there are a lot of players. Okay, so we've got all the local agencies, hundreds, I would say thousands of them if you add up water supply, wastewater, flood, stormwater, all of that at the local level. And then you've got some state agencies that are in the mix, including some like the State Water Project, Department of Water Resources, that manages this big system that delivers water, but they also do flood protection, and they have responsibility at the state level for environmental regulation, all of that. Then you've got the federal government that is a major, not just a funder of some things, but a major doer also. They own and operate the Central Valley Project. They run a lot of the flood control as well. So that, combined with all the people who are engaged stakeholders in sort of what we call sometimes civil society, so environmental groups, environmental justice groups, local government groups, all of that, business groups, and getting everybody to be on the same page sometimes can be hard. I think we've seen a lot of success of locals working well together and working regionally to do things. It's harder sometimes to do the really big projects at the sort of state level than it used to be. And some of that has to do with getting everybody on the same page about how we're going to fund it, how we're going to do it in ways that kind of manage trade-offs that are inherent in water management.
Well, that's kind of, that adage, and it's, that really worn out line about, fighting over water issues. And even for those, the family, we still find ways to be in conflict with each other. And I know you spoke that era of conflict. Is there really, or I guess I'll ask the question a different way. How do we move from that era of conflict to one of reconciliation? And just selfishly, how do you get to collaboration? How do you get to a collaborative process? Are people willing to do the work and to be able to sit at people at the table where they fundamentally disagree to find sort of that next best solution?
So, there are definitely examples we can all cite of where it's not working, but there are also some examples where we've really gotten past those squabbles and have found ways to make it work. And I think in what I've seen across the state, where you find that is where people are willing to say, okay, let's work on together on what we can agree on and what we each need, and try to, not have it be about a win for my side or a win for your side, but how do we get some joint wins? And there's more common ground opportunity than people realize a lot of times if you kind of focus on that approach.
Well, it reminds me, I love to be that Southern California guy who'll come up sometimes and do those forums in the Capitol or even the northern end of the state, where that messaging, that narrative, still will not die about, what the North does and how it looks at the South and South looks at the North. It's at a certain point now, I think I've probably been at this long enough, shaking my head, it's like, come on, dude, can we just move on and find a way to resolve some issues? And I'm recalling back a time when I was actually in conversation with a member of the legislature who actually put out, hey, I think water ought to remain where it falls. And I couldn't help myself but to then ask the question, well, if that's the case in state policy, does that mean that, tax revenues should remain where they're generated? Your job is to manage the whole state and make everything work. And we still have this narrative of, nah, you're here to take mine and I'm here to take yours. And I think as you described it, it's sort of, I bang my chest or I pull out my shield and we're just going to go to battle and see who the last one standing is. And it just seems to me there's got to be a better way. And you guys have studied that pretty intently.
Yes, we have. And I guess, Charlie, I'm not as pessimistic about some of these geographic kind of rivalries as maybe you are. And I'm sensing in the sense that, so I live in the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm not hearing a lot of complaints up here about Southern California right now. I mean, people recognize we're in a drought. Actually, we're hit harder up here. Some of our communities, Marin, Sonoma, are hit really hard right now, and folks are really tightening their belts. And one of the things that we're going to see happening, I think, is some additional moves toward really creating more regional interconnections of the type that are so helpful in Southern California, so that a community like Marin is not just dependent really on local water supply when they're in a pinch, right? So I think I get the sense folks learn a lot from the experimentation and innovation that happens at the local level elsewhere, and sort of at the regional level. And there's a lot of opportunities for sharing. The big challenges of our time are, to me, really about how we adapt our system for the changing climate. And that's, making our drought. We're used to droughts in California. We're used to variable precipitation. We're used to wet years and floods, but that's all getting kind of amped up on steroids now with the changing climate. And we've seen with this drought, we're getting hot droughts now. This is the second hot drought in a row without a whole lot of time in between them. And figuring out how we manage water for the environment at the same time that we have water available for people's needs and for our agricultural sector, which is a really important sector, in nationally and world over. Those are tough nuts to crack.
Well, that's part of my learning, right? It used to be either or, and now it's really a conversation about, all the above, and how do we do this together? Because you can't do one without the other. What you do on the urban or industrial side affects the environment, affects agriculture, and we're all really in this together. And I guess it's kind of a silly question, but you guys are the think tank, right? You guys take the time, you dig in, you have the expertise and all the challenges. What is it, your perspective, that keeps some of those state policymakers from implementing? I mean, it would be nice if you just submitted your report to the legislature and they said, "Oh, thank God, Ellen Hanak's here. Yes, next."
So, I will say I don't feel ownership on any of the ideas that we kind of promote, but because I think a lot of times what we do is we do analysis, but we also try to really use convenings, focus groups, workshops with stakeholders as sounding boards for those ideas, and kind of collect good ideas from people. So, when we make recommendations, it's usually because there are multiple folks out there who've said this would be a good idea. Can you think about how to propose it? I feel like we're making some progress, Charlie. Honestly, we the last major drought, we enacted legislation for sustainable groundwater management, which I know in Southern California folks have been doing that for a while, and really stewarding their groundwater basins, but that hasn't been the case in many parts of the state. And now there's a law that requires that to be done, and there's progress being made on it. Second area I would say is human right to water. Recognition law that was passed in 2012 that didn't identify any specific implementation, but basically set a framework for thinking about universal access to safe and accessible, affordable, reliable water. And that's a path that California is on right now, with money and more authorities legislatively to do that, and so on. So I feel like those are both big projects that are, things we've seen launched in the last decade.
Well, money always seems to help, particularly when you're talking about programs, initiatives, and facilities. And I can't help but be a little retrospective in that, California has a deep, rich sort of history of either individuals or organizations that really sort of stepped out front and you'll say, kind of pounded the table and made something happen, whether it was, State Water Project, we talk about governors, we talk about, kind of big stuff. And I'm kind of curious, though, as we sort of do this evolution with new legislators, new people coming into the business, because it takes a long time to develop expertise. We stand on the shoulders of people who did great work. your perspective with the folks you interact with, where are the next leaders? Where are they coming for today and tomorrow? Where are they coming from? What do they look like? Are they in universities? Are they coming into public policy? Are they in business and industry? How do you see that next chapter of leadership developing?
Well, I think it's kind of a little bit of all the above, and maybe there's some ways in which we're seeing seeing more diversity in the faces who are managing water systems than before. It used to be really very heavily dominated by engineers, because it's you need engineers as part of the system, but you're seeing more and more folks coming in with planning background, with science background, with kind of management background, and you're seeing many more women in management positions now. You see that at the federal level, you see it at the state level, you see it at the local level, and you're seeing just diversity that's getting closer toward mirroring the diversity of California. And I think one important kind of new element in terms of, we've always had folks sort of in the environmental community who've been important in helping to move the conversation along. But if we think about stakeholder groups, the environmental justice community has become a really important voice now that was not there 30 years ago, and I think is really helping to create a conversation that's just more holistic, and that's important.
Well, I know our time is short today, and I really appreciate you being with us, but I can't let you go. And you and I have shared the stage in a number of places over a number of years, and I've always appreciated that. But I gotta ask, what is it about this that you love? I mean, how did you get to do what you do? Did it find you? Did you find it? Why did you focus on water?
So when I started working on water in California about 20 years ago, when I moved here, I was working internationally before that. I was working a lot on agricultural issues internationally. So I had an ag background and I had an economics background. And when I came to the Public Policy Institute of California, they hired me and said, we think ag is important in California. Take a look at that. The organization was very young at the time, so they were still kind of feeling our way. And then they said, but our board said water might be a good thing to look at. So take a look at that too. And I went around and kind of had conversations around the state with folks and decided water would be a great way to marry a broader interest in something really important for California with some of my ag background. And it's been so fun because I learned something every day. It's a rich area to work in. So I would encourage anybody who's thinking about jumping into this field to don't be too scared and jump into it.
Well, I cannot thank you enough. And as I said, I have always enjoyed our working relationship. I love the work that you guys do. I always know where the blueprint is. I know where the map is. And I know if I need an answer, I know I can call you and you'll have actually looked at it and been very thoughtful about it. So I very much appreciate that. And I thank you for being a part of our new series. This is, I think, going to be very important in communicating to our public and talk about, how do decisions get made and how do we do it better as we move forward. So thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, we get to welcome Newsha Ajami. Newsha is the director of the Urban Water Policy with Stanford University's Water in the West. She's one of those leading experts, and I got to tell you, she's one of the high-end experts in sustainable water resource management, smart cities, and the water, energy, food nexus. She's really good at using data science principles to study the human and policy dimensions of urban water and hydrologic systems. I mean, it gets complicated quick, but Dr. Ajami is really good at this. I also want to just share that Dr. Ajami doesn't just sit in that ivory tower. She actually puts herself into practice, where she was confirmed to the San Francisco Public Utility Commission in December of 2020, and she served another variety of appointed positions at the state and local level. So it's not just science, but she takes that and she puts it into practical application for, how does it affect the daily lives of people that she is surrounded by. So Newsha, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
I got to kind of start, as we just because it's, drought season, but there is a historic perspective, in California. And I'm just curious, sort of as a grounding, how do you see California's approach to water management? I'll use the more term, like water resiliency, really, and drought cycles, because we may either be in a new one or extended an old one, but regardless, we're sort of in a drought cycle. But how do you see historically where California is in its approach, and then kind of how do we look at looking out the front windshield, and what to do next, as opposed to just what happened historically?
Sure. It's really a pleasure to be here. I think putting this into historical perspective, obviously, we built this very, very sophisticated infrastructure system in California that has helped us to thrive and grow as a community. And a lot of that system depends on snowpack and precipitation patterns that we used to have. And unfortunately, because of the impacts of climate change, we are seeing a significant shift in the way things work. So we're not getting as much snowpack, we're getting more rain than snow. The timing of it has shifted. And this infrastructure and sophisticated infrastructure model that we have is just really not adapted to manage or handle this shift. And another piece of this is we used to actually get these episodic drought periods that were not as frequent or as hot. So we would get enough time in between different droughts that our ecosystem would have a chance to recover, our water system would have a chance to recover, our groundwater basins would have a chance to recover. And unfortunately, what we are seeing more and more is these more frequent and hotter droughts that are not giving enough time for our system to recover. So this has all been an issue in the past 10 years with these more frequent droughts. One thing I would say is, though, California has come a long way, because every extreme droughts that we have had in the past number of decades have led to a change of patterns, changing the way we use water, changing the way we manage water, changing the way we deal with our infrastructure. So all those droughts have been opportunities to change. The only problem is we have been always very much reactive to drought. As soon as it happens, we're like, okay, what should we do? What should we do now? So, not as proactive as we should be. And as we're getting more frequent and hotter droughts, we have to be a little bit better at that.
Well, it's one of those, good news, bad news stories, right? Good news, newspapers or in TV, they're reporting on the issue, by showing dried up lakes. But by the time the lakes have dried up, like, yeah, that's a little bit late.
Exactly.
Well, I know then we talked then about how to address some of these issues and sort of that look forward. And a lot of folks use that term, and the governor in his water resiliency portfolio, they use that term, and we use the term a lot in Southern California. We need an all the above approach. What does all the above mean? Because there's a lot of folks come to the table with a particular interest. I'm looking out for, the environment, for the ecosystem, for, urban ag, whatever it happens to be. So you take all of that diversity, and everybody kind of comes to the table with their expertise, but if you're really looking at an all the above so that it doesn't become overwhelming, what does that mean? What does that mean to you?
Sure. That's a great question. Look, I think California, we always talk about California as if it's all the same, but the reality is every region in California is different. We have regions that are more populated than others. We have regions that are more water rich than others. So, we have diverse set of uses and demands. So we are a very diverse state. Our opportunities are also quite different. Depending on which part of the state we live in, we might have different kind of local water supplies. We might have different opportunities to conserve and save. So it's a very diverse community when it comes to California. And I think when you talk about resilience, for me personally, it comes from, there are like three major pieces goes into resilience. One is, how much diversity of demand do we have? Who's using water, how, where? The second thing is, what kind of supplies are out there that can meet this demand? For example, can be reuse water in certain parts to meet some of the demand that is not necessarily tailoring water to the quality that we need for certain needs, for example, for flushing toilets or watering outdoor spaces. Then the next question is, do we have groundwater basin? Can we reuse water and put it in the groundwater basin and recover it, as some parts of Southern California does? Do we actually have regional opportunities for people to work together and invest in solutions that can help the region to improve its system? So the resiliency of demand, resiliency of supply, and then the last piece of it is the resiliency of our institutions and governance structure. You can have all the diversity of demand and supplies, but if you don't have really good institutions, you might have really an issue or challenge of changing the way we do things. And I think then that comes down to, is our utility system or the business model that it has is built for today's challenges that we are facing? Do we have the proper infrastructure or investment infrastructure that's needed to meet the challenge of today? Do we have right talents? We are in a digital age. Do we really have, is our water sector really moving towards a different, talent pool to deal with this digital transformation? And that is also part of resilience. So I think it's just, and also, and as part of that also is, what kind of financial model do we have? Do we have different funding and financing sources that can help us to deal with this challenge that we are facing with climate change and changing patterns, which would be very, very different from what we had before? We can't continuously depend on, for example, bonds and, different kind of bonds to deal with our infrastructure needs. So it's just diversity of all these things are key. So that's how I see resilience, is all of the above sort of format.
So, well, that leads me though to kind of an interesting next question. Is it really that we have, with the changing climate, we have a water shortage? Is it a water management issue? Is it a behavioral issue? I mean, can these things, again, be solved through one or two mechanisms, or is this too an all the above kind of approach?
That's actually an excellent question. I think for California, it's definitely first and foremost is the management issue, because and sort of law and regulatory system that we have, or governance system that we have, that's managing this system. So we, it's quite rigid. It's built for the 20th century model. It sort of still dictates the same model as we are dealing with new challenges. If you think about it, the way we, for example, invest in infrastructure, we are thinking about the same performance measures or the same format that we were thinking about in the 20th century. And I think that is definitely a key issue as we are sort of facing these new challenges. We have to sort of revisit the governance structure and management systems that we have. I'll give you a simple example. Think about how we do plumbing in our cities, right? At the time that we started bringing water to people's homes and, putting toilets and then dishwashers, later dishwashers and washing machines, we actually plumbed for water comes in, it's used once, it leaves the system, right? It's this once true system, which worked in the 20th century, but it's not going to work in the 21st century anymore. So the question is, how do we reconfigure this system? And do we have the right institutions for that? Can we actually achieve this change based on the same institutions? Then you ask the question of, is this a behavioral issue or not? And I would say that the way we set up the system has led to a behavior response that is also as problematic right now. Majority of people don't know where their water is coming from, where it's going, right? And that means that they're using water, in a way that it's quite mindless. We don't think about it. It just comes in, we use it. If it's using it for outdoors, fine. If it's using it for whatever purpose we're using it for, we're not thinking about the source, the impact, the challenges. And that leads to a behavior that's not going to help us as we're dealing with these challenges. So I think it goes hand in hand.
Well, I hear what you're saying. I know when we did some polling a few years ago, and we asked, sort of average residents here in Southern California, where does your water come from? Or we asked them first, where's the Bay Delta? Knowing that that's the majority, 30% of the water. And they said, well,
we don't know.
The Delta it's over there at the sink. So, well, where's your water come from? Right over the Delta faucet at the sink. So, out of sight, out of mind. And I think you're right. So that actually then kind of triggers, though, the next level down of when we get into stressed periods like we are today, where you do have the headlines and people are being told, and God love the news media, it's usually an alarmist at that point, oh my goodness. And then you start talking about conservation, you talk about efficiency, and efficiency versus conservation. Do you see them as one and the same or as different? Because I'm seeing people now trying to respond on top of conservation matters from 2016. And that fungibility in the system isn't maybe quite as what it used to be. It's a little harder to start, really squeezing down in a time of crisis versus that regular efficiency of utilizing the resource more efficiently, whether it's energy or water or what have you.
Yeah, they're different, that for sure. Conservation has a little bit more of a behavioral aspect to it, which means we are changing certain things in the way we do things to use less water. Efficiency is much more specific. It's just actually increases the productivity of our water supplies. And as we are putting more laws and regulations or sort of changing our codes and standards or building new fixtures and appliances, we are achieving more and more efficiency in the system. Conservation, it's more like, okay, I'm not going to water my lawns for the next year or next 3 months or 6 months as we are dealing with the drought. But if I go and replace all that lawn with, native landscaping, then I actually have become much more efficient because it's permanently changed the way I use water. So they're different. I would say the challenge of not seeing as much conservation in California right now, it's twofold, in my opinion. One is we have a little bit of a mixed messaging going on. We definitely see in the media people talking about water shortages and the drought. And there are some utilities that actually right now have enough water that they don't see any reason to press people to use less water. They are hoping that eventually next year will be wet. And if they can sell the water now, why not? Because it's, we talked about this a little bit. The business model our water sector has is a little outdated. So it doesn't reward, conservation, especially when you're at the utility level. It can really hurt these utilities. They're mostly municipal utilities. Whatever revenue comes in goes into operating and maintaining the system. Right. So it is the issue that you see there. So it's this mixed messaging is impacting the way people are responding to this drought right now.
I totally get it. It's a hard thing for somebody to tell you not to buy their product. It's hard to make things work.
Exactly.
Well, and so then we get into times like we are now. We get some stressful periods, and there are some big things still sitting out on the horizon that folks are trying to work through. Things like Bay Delta and modernizing the water delivery system, et cetera. Is there room, in your opinion, for collaboration, or are we just sitting waiting for the warring parties to, wait for the next fight season, right? When the legislature begins in January, we're just going to, put the gear back on and go back to battle?
I think there's plenty of room for collaboration. And I think California's path to getting out of this crisis or continuously kind of sort of reoccurring crisis is to actually do a lot more collaboration and cooperation. At the end of the day, we all need this resource. We all have to work together, and our long-term sustainability depends on how we all sort of act as a collective rather than individuals who are trying to maximize their own personal benefit at the end. I think just to give you an example, this water system we have has connected us from north to south to east to west, right? Which means that every action that we take alongside these corridors can reduce our pressure off the system and sort of make the system last longer, right? So whatever we can do locally to take pressure off the system, for example, in Southern California, I know Metropolitan Water District for the longest time, they had this program that they provided incentives for people to develop local supplies. And that financial means, while it wasn't necessarily that huge, had helped to spur some action around, building local supplies, and that has definitely helped, right? Very similar for example, in Northern California, we have these communities, for example, the Bay Area, we all connected through the Hetch system. So as we reduce our, size of our straw from that system, we can leave more water for others who don't have as much water, for communities that really lack resources to access more water, and also leave more water for the ecosystem. So I think none of that would happen unless there's trust in the system, there's collaboration and cooperation. If there's no trust, we can never really move forward.
Well, there are so many questions, and I love talking to you so much. We could talk literally all afternoon, but our time is a little bit short. But I got to ask you this. I mean, you were so passionate, and you're so engaged, somebody that commits themselves not just to the academic side of the equation, but to also then volunteer in the public policy arena, which is a whole different animal in and of itself. Why have you chosen personally? Why did you choose to focus on water policy? What is it that drives your interest and your incredible energy around this topic?
Great question. So I'm an engineer by training. I have 3 different engineering degrees, water resources, like civil and environmental engineering degrees. But I would say I took a class when I was at the University of Arizona on water law and policy. And very quickly I realized, doesn't matter how much I try to engineer this system, unless I really can understand and sort of connect policy and laws with engineering solutions, we cannot really move forward. My engineered solutions are not going to sort of be the future. And I mean, that's where the passion started. And I ended up working for the legislature for a year, which was quite eye-opening. And you can see how important it is to be engaged in the process, to understand and build solutions that can address public policy issues at any given time. And it's very hard to do it unless you are involved in the actual public policy process. Then you can actually see what works, what doesn't work, what drives change. So that's how my passion around this topic started. And I have been trying to kind of create this bridge between science and engineering and policy throughout the years.
I can see you be very popular on the college campus from all the different departments. Like, yeah, you need to take a little law, you need to take a little engineering, you need to take a little bit of everything.
Yes, a little bit of everything. Absolutely.
Like Dr. Ajami, thank you so very much. I greatly appreciate you being part of our dialogue and helping folks understand. As you know, we continue to try to build coalitions and bring people the education and the knowledge. People like yourselves, I mean, this is incredibly valuable. And thank you for helping be a part of today's show.
Thank you so much for having me. It was really a pleasure talking to you.
So now let's welcome Faith Kearns. Faith is a scientist and science communication practitioner. She writes about water, wildlife, and climate change. And her new book, Getting to the Heart of Science Communication, is now available wherever books are sold. Faith, welcome. Thanks so very much for being with us.
Thank you, Charles. Thanks for having me.
You know, I kind of, because our time is short, I want to really, not to be punny, but I'm going to be punny. Let's just jump kind of into the deep end of the pool. Because I was going through your book and I noticed you kind of mentioned that, in modern science, we kind of like idealize this idea of rationality and objectivity. But you argue that the scientist, really needs to start getting comfortable with messy emotions and working with the community. I mean, we go through that with engineers. They can design anything, and if they just throw enough facts at you, then somehow, everything just sort of flows. Why is it important to know when a commitment in objectivity may get in the way of good public policy and sort of that wrestling between facts, figures, and sort of getting at people's emotions and how people make decisions on public policy?
Yeah, so I think the question of objectivity is really interesting one. I quote a journalist in the book who says basically that, the idea of objectivity is just the sort of subjectivity of those in power, or of the status quo. And so even the concept itself is really challenging. What does it mean to be objective? And in many ways, the current sort of scientific method was designed to help overcome subjectivity, but somehow morphed into talking about scientists and humans as objective themselves, which is not quite what the original intention of scientific objectivity was. And so I think if we can sort of put that concept aside, and also see that the kinds of issues that we're dealing with these days, so for me, I work on wildfire and climate change and water and drought. These are issues that have incredibly strong emotional meanings for people. They can also bring a lot of conflict and sometimes trauma, particularly in the case of disasters. And so not dealing directly with the emotion that comes with these issues, I think, is detrimental to the kind of work that we're trying to do.
Well, what are your tips then for talking about difficult subjects? I mean, there's a lot of misinformation. I mean, clearly, if you go to the national narrative, it's, you kind of pick your tribe and you sort of find your narrative and you just pound on each other. But I mean, you speak about emotional intelligence, cultural understanding. How is it that you kind of take that next step, or at least for those that try, what are the tips that you would have for trying to get at those subjects and try to get to the intelligence and blend with it facts on the ground?
Well, I think one of the first things, and in some ways it's very obvious, and in other ways we don't practice it a lot, which is, particularly when it comes to science communication, or really any kind of scientific, technical, research-based communication, people tend to focus a lot on speaking well and sort of giving a lot of factual information and just sort of, bombarding people with facts. And I think what can actually work better a lot of the time is to just stop and listen. And although that sounds really easy, in practice, it's actually an incredibly difficult thing to do and to do well. And one of the things that I talk about a lot is that one of the reasons it's so difficult is that if you actually are willing to hear what somebody else is saying, it can often bring up a lot of internal conflict, right? And we tend to think of conflict with other people as being about those other people being problematic, right? The conflict is because this person is X, Y, or Z way. But a lot of times what it really is that we're wrestling with sort of disjunctions within our own experience of somebody telling us something that we disagree with. And so learning to sort of sit with that internal discomfort of being told information you disagree with and just sit and listen through that and maybe be willing to change your own perspective is actually an incredibly difficult thing to do.
Well, that's something we spend a lot of time with here at the Coalition. And we have that conversation a lot. I mean, you can kind of put your tribe around you. We can sit at tables and we can be the smartest guys in the room. If those knuckleheads over there would just do what we tell them to do, then everything would be great. And we don't take time to really listen and take in and kind of come up with what is that next best solution. We've already, it seems like, by the time I've done the study, I already know the answer. And, I can see where that's a very difficult hump to get over. Have you seen places where people have really been successful with that? Or, I mean, how do you kind of get people to that? I mean, it's easy to say, right? How do I actually go do it? And so that I get better, policy out of that?
Yeah, so I think it's an interesting thing, right? There, and we're talking almost about two different things in a certain way, although they're very interlinked. One of which is how do you listen as an individual? And then how do you listen on a sort of what you might call a more organizational or systemic level? And the individual listening certainly feeds into that sort of larger listening. And so I think again, at an individual level, there are lots of things you can do to sort of just up your ability to sit with discomfort when you disagree with somebody. And then on a sort of more systemic level, organizational level, I think there are many, many interesting pieces of work being done. I tried to cover some of those in my book. One is a really interesting example from some UC Irvine and Stantec research folks who really took on a listening project in the Santa Ana watershed, attempting to like really listen to what water users need and not just the typical water users, which tend to be homeowners, right? We focus a lot on property owners. And so they were really sort of trying to say there are other people in this watershed, the homeless, people who are traditionally not included in sort of water planning. And they really took that seriously. And it has actually resulted in a report that identifies some pretty clear and straightforward changes that they can make in how they do water communication.
Yeah, I certainly get that, right? As elected officials, oh, I care about property owners because those are voters. If you're not voting, do I really care? I can see where that'd be a difficult transition. Now, the other piece that I see, and it's just sort of kind of where we are in the 21st century, and that is, you know, in the world of social media and 30-second sound bites, little videos, you know, what are the top 5 takeaways, and how do you really kind of get beyond that sound bite I like to refer to as bumper sticker slogan for challenging issues? Because nothing is ever as simple as we try to make it out to be, to get it out in a tweet or in a, you know, a really quick fashion.
Yeah, I mean, I think to me, the social media thing is a tip of a very large iceberg and shouldn't sort of make up an entire communications practice or perspective, right? It's just a piece of what we do. And so what I've tried to argue in this book is that while that kind of, you know, giving a TED talk or that kind of thing is a certain type of, you know, technical communication, at the end of the day, like a lot of things happen on the ground between people. And so I think the more that we can kind of get into what I call relational communication, which is focusing on relationships between people, which then cascades into all these other sort of what you might put under an umbrella of emotionally intelligent skills, which would be things like listening, like being able to withstand and work with conflict, not necessarily to resolve the conflict, which is where we often go, is how do we sort of fix or squash this conflict, but much more in the vein that we need to kind of be able to be comfortable working through conflict, which may go on for a long time. And that's okay, that there's something important in that. Another important thing I think is really understanding that some of these issues can be deeply traumatic for people. So we tend to, again, not think about the deep feelings that people have about water. So for example, all the time people say to me, how do you get people to care about water? And it's so interesting to me because my experience is people already care deeply about water. When I say that I work on water, anybody I'm talking to, wherever I am, whether it's with relatives in, say, France, or in conversations with artist friends in San Francisco, everybody has something that they care deeply about when it comes to water. And so I find it very strange that we act like people don't care. And so on the other side of that, I think people can often have sort of traumatic relationships to some of these things, like not having water access. Drought, I know for myself as someone living in California, is this ongoing kind of potential trauma of whether or not it's going to rain again. So I think just taking seriously that there are these deep feelings about things, and then becoming somebody who is able to be skilled working through those with people is a really, really important set of tools that we just don't talk about that much.
Well, that's an important point. You know, people's perspective, everybody has a different perspective. And so it is going to touch a different sort of emotional hot button. And as you just pointed out, I mean, we make jokes about it here in California, but water is a deeply emotional issue. I may not know where my water comes from exactly. I just know it's really damn important in my life. Right. Tell us about an example, though. I know you had a very clear example in your book about how the University of California Cooperative Extension, you were helping Hmong farmers in the Central Valley. They were trying to attain grants and give them tools for some really needed sustainable groundwater practices. Very important, very emotional in that community, in that context. But tell us a little bit about how that came about.
Yeah, so I was super happy to be able to interview my colleague, Ruth Dahlquist-Willard, who's a small farms advisor for UC Cooperative Extension in the Fresno area. And during our last, drought, the 2012 to 2016, which may be the same drought we're still in, who knows? But, basically what had happened was, like so many people, we were facing water shortages all over the state. And for the Hmong farmers in particular, they often almost exclusively work on leased land. And some of the folks that they were leasing land from were having water reductions or prioritizing water for other uses. And it sparked a bit of a mental health crisis within that community. And Ruth, along with her colleague Michael Yang, who's Hmong himself and works with UC Cooperative Extension, basically undertook what I would call a listening project to basically try to understand what might best help and serve these farmers. And although it's not work that they would have done, it's not research, what they ended up doing was quite a bit of technical assistance to both connect farmers who were facing water shortages to a grant program that the state was offering, which requires, a set of paperwork an inch high to do. And the language barriers are quite intense with this technical language. And so they ended up hiring some folks who helped these Hmong farmers to fill out their paperwork and get grants that helped them to get new irrigation pumps and things that reduced their electricity needs and therefore increased their bottom lines. And those are the kinds of things that I think are super interesting. They're not the kinds of flashy things that get media attention, right? And so often in science communication in particular, it's been all about getting media attention. This kind of work doesn't get media attention, and yet it's incredibly important when we think of ourselves as public servants.
Well, you're right. You take those big, broad policy perspectives. It's nice to talk about, hey, we got $1 billion for, water and equity and access. Cool. Yes. Now, how do you actually make a difference in individuals' lives? Because at the very micro level, that's where it really, not to be punny again, but that's where the rubber meets the road. Yep. I got to ask though, this is incredibly interesting to me, how somebody, goes from deep science and numbers and statistics and then attaching that to emotional intelligence and how to really be understood. How does somebody choose to specialize in this field? Just like part psychologist, part scientist, part, author. How do you end up, did this find you, or did you go out and have a deep passion for finding these particular issues and this level of study?
I would say for the most part, things have found me, and then it became more intentional. So I grew up in Arizona in the high mountain desert, and, everything in Arizona is about water. You don't go for a hike without going to water. And so it was always just an integral part of my life that I then decided to study. And it was sort of through the process of studying it. And I should say that at the same time, I also was a communications work studies student at my undergraduate university. So I was majoring in science, but working in communications. So everything I know about communications is almost solely through practice, which I've done for 30 years at this point. And so I was lucky enough to find a position that married these two things, where I worked as a communications intern for a scientific society. And it wasn't even called science communication at the time. This kind of work didn't have a name, but I just pursued the passion. I loved both of them equally. And then I would say what has happened in terms of having to contend really with the sort of emotional contentious piece of things is just working on the issues that I work on. When I say that I'm sort of following work that just seems valuable and important and isn't necessarily what's going to get me ahead or, make me popular, I would say that it's really been just kind of following the need and just seeing that the ways that we talk about things like, for example, wildfire, when I first started working on it in the mid 2000s, people just didn't have any sense of the traumatic nature of these issues. And to me, it was just a huge, huge underaddressed issue that I've had to figure out for myself because my own practice of communication was flailing in the face of not paying attention to these things.
Well, I hear what you're saying. I guess I started with the coalition. What we try to do, we educate to advocate. I kind of figure if we have enough dialogue where you got to actually do the work. Mm-hmm. This is not somebody's just going to hand this to you on a platter and oh my goodness, thank goodness you're here to save the day. But you got to get in and really dig what advice, just to kind of close out, what advice would you give a group like us, which has a really big, broad, I like to say, advantage, we're big, broad, diverse. Disadvantage, we're really big, really broad and diverse, of communicating and bringing people together. How would you advise groups like ours to kind of come to the table, be a part of that dialogue to help make that difference with public policymakers?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, a lot of it just comes down to this issue of leading, sort of relationship first, and that may slow down the agendas that we all have. It may slow down the solutions that we think we have because people disagree with them. And I still think it's the only way to move forward on these really emotional, contentious issues that have meaning in people's lives, So I say relationship first with an eye toward justice. And that's kind of where we're at with the water world right now.
Faith, I can't thank you enough. Important work you're doing, a really good read for folks that want to go get your book. That'd be a great way, I think, to help kind of start that dialogue, is to expose yourself to somebody who's had to learn the hard lessons. And you certainly have done that. And I'm just incredibly grateful for you being with us today and helping us set that table for the water dialogue.
Thank you so much for engaging with the material. It's really such an honor to have people, learn from and be willing to spend the time, because I know we're all busy right now. So thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks, Faith. Well, thanks for joining us on What Matters Water TV and Podcast. If you like today's discussion, go to where you download your podcasts and give us a 5 rating and a big thumbs up. That'll help us build our presence in this new world and on this format. If you're interested in helping sponsor this program, please reach out to us, SoCalWater.org, and send us a message. We'd love to have you as part of our broadcast series. As we close out today's show, I leave you with this challenge. Be a part of the conversation. Be a part of the solution. At the Southern California Water Coalition, we educate to advocate. So as public policy leaders have difficult choices to make, we help them by making informed decisions. Thanks for being with us. We'll see you again next time on What Matters Water TV and Podcast.